Welcome, everyone. Today, we will hear from Dan Kammen on the subject of climate science and the fight for justice. On campus, Dan Kammen is the Distinguished Professor of Sustainability at Berkeley. As co-chair of the Berkeley Roundtable on Climate and Energy Justice, he's been involved in the hiring of 12 new faculty. Additionally, and importantly, Professor Kammen serves as the senior advisor for energy innovation at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. For Ali at Berkeley, Dan has been a highly regarded faculty member and speaker. He was Ali's first honoree of our Excellence in Teaching and Learning Award given to Berkeley faculty who contribute in the classroom and matched by their public commitments in the outer world. Dan's talk will be recorded today and posted online at Ali at Berkeley's YouTube site once it's been captioned. If you would like to ask a question, please put your question in the chat room, and Professor Kammen will answer questions as he proceeds. Without further ado, Professor Dan Kammen.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. Thanks to the Ali team. I really appreciate, and thanks to all of you for connecting on what I'm hoping you'll agree either now or after we get going as maybe the most interesting change in the energy and climate landscape in some time. So as was highlighted, I will watch the chat. And so if there's questions that kind of lead naturally from where we are, I'll try to weave them in. And again, if there's things that you want us to make sure we cover, just drop them in there. Again, I'll try to go back and forth. But again, thanks everyone for joining. So I'm delighted to be here. I've been back to Ali events a number of times, and today I want to sort of focus on something that's maybe to some people will feel like a subset of the energy and climate landscape we're in. To me, actually, and to I think many faculty working on topics of climate, in many ways, it is the biggest breath of fresh air. It's the most interesting new development in the climate space in a while. And I mean that more than the exciting developments in terms of the prices of solar and wind power, things that I'll refer to kind of obliquely in the talk. And if there's any questions, again, just fire away. But I really do want to focus on this theme of not only what is the just energy transition with just the most important capitalized word there, but really what does it mean in practical terms? And I think thankfully, a lot of what I'll talk about at the national and international level really stems from things that at least got part of their start, if not in California, actually in Berkeley and the Bay Area in particular. So really looking forward to talking about these things. And again, I will really try to monitor the chat as we go to get connected. Just a bit of orientation. I run a laboratory at Berkeley called RAEL, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. And if there's any material from this talk, I'm going to place it all there. And also if you follow Twitter or actually Instagram too and things, but I try to really keep it on Twitter. We tend to post a post or two a day about what's going on in this world. And so you can see it right there. We use my own individual handle, not just the lab one. So Dan_Kammen if you want to take a look at any things we're going to talk about today. Let me just kind of jump in. So really what I wanted to highlight is that something has changed. The dialogue around climate has evolved for a variety of reasons, having to do, I think, with a mixture of youth dissatisfaction and a feeling of disengagement on many of the climate issues. The Greta Thunberg, Alexandra Villa-Sefor, Julia Nkate, led efforts with Friday really highlighted the degree to which young people do not feel that they are clearly engaged in the conversation, certainly not empowered in the conversation in the way they should. And so this is really meant to be just kind of a a poster of the hopeful, the happy kinds of statements. Climate impacts affect us all, but they affect the least empowered, the most vulnerable, the poorest, the brownest, the women most strongly. I think we all kind of know that, but it is finally on the international agenda in some very clear ways. And so being in the conversation is great. It's important, but I think the real challenge is, what does it actually mean to turn that attention into action? And for a variety of reasons, I would say we have not turned it into action successfully yet, on a variety of fronts. I mean, the fact that Pakistan at peak 2 weeks ago was 1/3 underwater, that's bad in itself. But 10 years ago, Pakistan also went through droughts and floods. And there was great discussion that we were going to do differently. We were going to recognize that the climate, the water extremes in Pakistan were leading to massive climate-related damage, and in particular damage to the poor. And here we are 10 years after the first set of floods, and Pakistan was no more prepared than before. And that's an international condemnation, not a local one, because Pakistan applied for and appealed for a variety of resources along the way. We are seeing not only the floods, but also droughts, the fires. There was recently protests in Australia over the billions of animals killed in their fires. We obviously see them here in California. And then the picture at on top right is of Skid Row, where my daughter works, running an NGO to provide infrastructure for people on Skid Row in terms of water and cooling centers and things that you would think public infrastructure would provide, but in fact it doesn't. And so again, I don't think any of this will surprise anybody who was kind enough to tune into this OLLI session, but I think it's really important to highlight how challenging the situation is right now in terms of, again, this dichotomy between language around Me Too and language around climate injustice and action in this area. And that's really what I'll try to focus on. So there's lots of individual routes to go down. They certainly link to issues about how can we design power systems that reflect the needs of the poor and don't marginalize them? How can we do things like providing access to electrified transportation, not just in terms of subsidies to purchase Teslas by the rich, but actually putting it in people's hands more broadly? How can we learn not only qualitatively, but quantitatively, what are the opportunities to do things differently? Can we use data science? Can we use advances in engineering? And I use engineering with a lowercase e. That's both physical systems, but also what can we do about understanding the social opportunities. And I'll come back to one of my favorite social advances later on in a bit. Can we make decentralized, reliable energy not just something that means clean energy on the rooftops of people who were subsidized by the state, but low-income housing projects? And then really, what are the implications of the clean energy transition that we know we have to have in terms of its impact on people, in terms of the potential damages of becoming reliant on not a fossil fuel economy, but on certain critical materials, be they lithium, cobalt, tantalum, cadmium, a variety of materials that today are harvested with really large amounts of social injustice, not only to minorities and women, but to children who are often very high on the labor list for many of these materials. So there's a lot of pieces of this that are tied together. And again, I'll try to illustrate them. But really for me, the start is that I don't get to do anything in my laboratory without the amazing effort of not only a really talented group of students, but also the directives and the missions and the statements of many of our students. And see, Gail just put in a comment in the chat thinking about government mandates versus the private sector. And yes, I'll definitely come to that in a variety of forms. And if I don't, please call me on it. But I plan to highlight a number of the areas where we learn in one area and then maybe transition it to another. And so just as this is a kind of a snapshot of some of the former PhD students in my lab, it's both a fairly diverse group, thankfully, but it's also a group that have really moved into important positions. And certainly making solar available for renters is something that the state of California is working on. And as you'll see in a few slides, the federal government is too, although these are challenging. And so in many ways, when we kind of think about the worsening climate situation, we think about not only the temperature rise that we have been seeing, that we are causing and are experiencing, but also the degrees to which we have had meeting after meeting after meeting. 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement was adopted. Last year, we had a contentious climate meeting. I would say contentious and relatively positive in Glasgow, COP26. And we're aiming towards next month, COP27 in Egypt, which has a number of interesting features. It'll be a return to Africa, defined geographically for the COP meetings, but it's also a COP meeting that is being sponsored by Coca-Cola. And that raises some kind of challenges and concerns on my part, but we'll certainly come back to that in a little bit. So in terms of the good news, I'll start there. If we look at our historical emissions, the roughly linear rise, that's the black curve showing how emissions have risen over the past decades. And if we turn back to the beginning of the Biden-Harris administration, we were essentially in that bluish band at the top, that the commitments, current policies around the world that countries had made would have resulted in about 3 degrees Celsius of warming, almost 6 degrees Fahrenheit. But what has happened since has been a series of pretty optimistic statements and commitments. The United States, in a largely unfunded mandate, but a mandate nonetheless, committed under President Biden to zeroing out carbon emissions from the energy sector by 2035. That's certainly something that many groups don't think is possible. Others, myself, I certainly do think it's possible, but we need to get on with the job. And those pathways that have been proposed, new targets in Europe, a 2060 carbon neutrality target in Nigeria, and also in China, are very interesting. They're a little late by my standards, but they're better than nothing. And given that we didn't even have standards till recently, I'm not going to turn anyone away at this point, but they really are parts of a path to get onto this olive green pathway, to get us to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's going to be a massive challenge. Many experts think it's not possible. I disagree with them, but it's going to be a massive challenge because we've already warmed by over 1.1 degrees. So we have less than 0.5 degree of headroom left. And really the challenge here is, A, can we do it? But B, can we do it in a way that promotes equity and justice? And just to summarize everything I'm going to say going forward, I would turn the question around. I think, A, we can get it done, but we won't get it done if we don't find ways to center gender and racial and socioeconomic justice, because I don't think it's solvable without bringing all of the population on board and bringing the population globally on board so they all benefit. And so there's a number of challenges in this so-called road to net zero. And you can see from this graphic, countries in red have set a mid-century 2050 target. That includes us, includes Canada, number of countries, Australia with their new government signed on, much of Western Europe, with a couple interesting exceptions, like Iceland and Sweden, that have set targets earlier than 2050. A few countries are really on schedule, Madagascar, which has other environmental challenges, the Gambia, a variety of others, but most are setting 2050 or later targets. And the challenge of those in purple is that 2050, 2060 is just too late. That might be a great start from where they are today, but those targets won't cut it. And China announced at the major party conference yesterday, President Xi announced that China was going to take an energy security first pathway to their climate target. And that is certainly a chilling statement in a variety of ways. So if we jump in and say, why am I optimistic and pessimistic? It's really pulled together in a bit of a complicated graph like this. And what this highlights is the rate of global decarbonization. This is something I did with Amory Lovins and a number of students a few years back. And this highlights how quickly or slowly we're decarbonizing at various points in time. And just to put it in perspective, that light blue or aquamarine at the far left from 1980 to 2010, the average global rate of decarbonization was about 1%. That level rose somewhat. It got up to almost 3% decarbonization in 2015. And then it steadily fell back under the prior administration, and this table has not yet been updated with how we're doing under President Biden. The answers are the results are not in yet, which is why I didn't put it on there. We know the numbers for the last 2 years, but COVID has made it complicated, and basically we are treading water. We're back in this kind of 1 to 2% decarbonization rate. The reason why I'm saying it is that if we want to get to zero carbon by 2050, we more or less need to not only achieve 3%, which you can see we didn't quite get to, but we got close in 2015, but we need to get there and we need to stay there year after year until 2050. And that's really this challenge of the climate story in front of us, where we need to recognize that we have to decarbonize energy, but we also need to repair dramatically damaged ecosystems, from large-scale issues to the war on biodiversity that we're sadly doing today, and recognize that there are other big challenges coming. Ukraine highlights how vulnerable the world's food system is, as just one other example in this process. And so we have a lot to do to avoid a whole set of challenges coming, from melting of the ice sheets to issues around food shortages, to damage to the Amazonian rainforest. Again, this is the kind of the super pessimistic but very real set of challenges we face in the greenhouse if we don't radically write the story. And so for all of the bad news, I would say that the real message here is that we need to not only do what we say, but we need to develop brand new tools. And in my view, the climate movement's newest tool, the newest opportunity, in my view, kind of the best reason to be optimistic is that climate justice is actually something which is now finally on the table. And so how do we take, the social awareness, the dialogue, the challenges of the movement, the social justice efforts, and really put that into action. And that's kind of what I want to highlight for the rest of our hour, and use it to illustrate that this is a really challenging story, but it opens some doors that should have been opened before, but were not. And so in many ways, this graphic illustrates just how out of whack we are, in the sense that the richest 1% of the people on the planet, not just in developed nations, but the richest 1% globally, contribute directly about 15% of global emissions. The richest 10%, of which almost, I suspect everybody here, but I don't want to speak for everyone's situation, but it's likely that everyone on this call is in that richest 10%, quite likely, but again, I don't want to make any assumptions. But that richest 10% of the world population contributes well over half of the greenhouse gas emissions over the last 25 years. The middle 40% on an income basis contribute about 40%, and the poorest half of the world's population contribute only 7%. So there's many ways to kind of wrap the story together. One version is that the richest 1% need to reduce their emissions by not a percentage, but by a full factor of 30 times. And that would permit the poorest the poorest part of society to increase their emissions by a factor of 3. And there's no sense that we're on a path to do that. But if anything, increasing emissions among the very poor opens up economic opportunities, social justice opportunities that would pay the world back in terms of stability, opportunities to partner. But this idea that the richest have to reduce their emissions massively, and the poor, we would all benefit if the poor increase their emissions a bit, is an equation for a just transition that we talk about academically, but are very far from in practice. When we think about it, there are some lessons from California's own story, which is certainly not one of climate justice and climate equity, but it highlights all the opportunities here. And so, as those of you who have heard me speak before, but have heard in many other talks, again, if you kind of look at the blogs, the podcasts that Leah Stokes, who will be interviewing the vice president in San Francisco tomorrow for her podcast, or Jigar Shah in the Department of Energy will talk about investments, or Shalonda Baker in the Department of Energy will talk about in her directing of the Office of Workforce Equity and Department of Energy. No, we in California did something fascinating. It's not perfect, but it is a remarkable model, and that is that after California passed its climate law in 2006, the so-called Pavley climate law, we set a target to be 20% powered by clean energy by 2010. We missed that target. We didn't get there till 2013, but our 2020 target was to be 1/3 powered by renewable energy, and we blew way past that in a good way. So in a mere 4 years, from 2013 to 2017, California met its 2020 target. We were so successful at doing so that California's pre-existing 2030 target, to be 50% powered by renewables, we increased that so that the goal now stands to be 60% powered by clean energy by 2030. And on average, we are there. Now, there's a big footnote I'll get to in a second. But what's interesting about this transition is that California did not include nuclear and did not include large hydro. They each have their proponents and their detractors. But they did this, like California did this largely with solar and wind and geothermal energy. So there is an interesting evolution there. In many ways, Germany and California, the world's 4th and 5th largest economies, set this target, and they use roughly the same clean energy sources. France, China, many other places, New York State, either emphasize large hydro or nuclear in the mix. We, 5th largest economy on the planet, have not. And the piece of this story that is most germane to this discussion of the just transition, and I would say is the most hopeful part, is actually an interesting piece. And that is that in passing California's climate bills, Assembly Bill 32, Senate Bill 32, Senate Bill 100, a whole variety of these, built into our package is a carbon cap and trade market. It's controversial. Some people want a carbon tax. Some people want a cap and dividend policy, a straight carbon tax like in British Columbia or in Sweden. These are all reasonable alternatives. But what California did earlier than anybody was to say that 35% of all of the revenues from our cap and trade system had to be put into a fund to be used to address underserved communities. And underserved is defined a little bit broadly. This is everything from fence line communities, irrespective of color or gender, to communities that are clearly minority in terms of socioeconomics, both race and income. And so here we have an interesting situation where the state put a floor, not a ceiling, on the amount of money to go to underserved areas. California has actually been, in some ways, struggling to find enough projects Not that they're not there, but our mechanisms and our biases often prevent the money from going, I would say, communities that most need it. But that is a world-leading piece of policy. It's actually one that California has shared around the world, in the sense that other states have also taken this strategy to effect. New York State now has a similar policy. And it is part of a recognition that funding underserved communities is key. And why I say it's so critical is for two reasons. One obvious, hopefully one not obvious. And that is, California is actually already quite close at certain times of the year to having a really wonderful climate plan. Last year, in April, the best time of year for clean energy in the state, when supplies are high, demand is low, California hit 95% of all energy coming from renewables, not over the whole year, but for a few hours and days in the spring, we're able to get there. And so California's plan of building out renewables has worked well. And you can see in this chart, the green is renewables, and that's the energy supply during a typical day. And so what you see here is that as the sun comes up, renewables ramp up. Wind is somewhat steady. It's better in the early morning, late afternoon, but with the big slug of solar, we actually get to a point of lots of clean energy during the day. You see, this is in April, our best time of year. Again, demand is not that high. Demand is less than half of what it was in early September, when we had the close call with brownouts and blackouts, and largely conservation by us all. Renewable energy on many rooftops saved us from going into brownout or blackout situations early in September. So there's a good story there. And actually this year we did even better, in the sense that April of this year, 2022, we briefly hit not 95%, but over 100%. Now, hitting it for a few minutes does not mean you can do it every day of the year. And in fact, at the worst point in last month, when demand was really high, the wind wasn't great, we were meeting our supply by having ramped up a lot of natural gas. We were lucky, if you believe it, during the blackouts or the near blackouts, because we were not also suffering massive fires. We had some fires, but not massive. And we didn't have huge winds that knocked out transmission lines. So even though it was a crisis, it was actually a fairly benign crisis. That's thought of in retrospect. Not so benign if you lived in, for example, Weed, that the town burned down, but benign on a statewide basis. And so we have the generation resources. We don't have the storage resources. We don't have sufficient clean transportation options, certainly not for those who are affluent. But we're an interesting starting ground. And it's why myself and many others have been highlighting that California is in a position to do much better than becoming carbon neutral in 2045. In fact, in this LA Times op-ed back in May, I called for California to move that target ahead by a full decade, to be looking at carbon neutrality by 2035. There have been other, even more aggressive claims. I think 2035 would be a real challenge, but it would be doable. And to me, the question is really, how do we reflect and benefit from climate and environmental justice? And I say that because if adding climate justice centrally to the story means we care, but are unable to do anything about the poor and the disenfranchised in the state, I don't think it benefits us much. In fact, what I and others have been arguing is that actually the more we look at this, the more we see that investing in climate just solutions actually makes our job of getting the whole state there not only easier, and I'll try to explain that, but cheaper. And that's the one that I think a lot of people have problems with, disagree, but I think the data is very clearly on the side that the opportunities are very much there. So there's a lot to do on this landscape. Here is one example of California at least putting its analytic and data might to work in ways that really highlight the opportunities. So California developed something called CalEnviro screen, and it is an environmental justice panel of indicators updated regularly by not only the state's own internal offices, but also by community groups, panels of experts, leaders in investing in communities. And it's basically an ongoing set of metrics, each one that's designed to highlight not our total greenhouse gas emission story, but the opportunities and the failings in terms of how we're serving the least served of us statewide. And so it's everything from ozone levels in impacted areas in Fresno to looking at cardiovascular disease and asthma, low birth weight in children, but in particular, those living in areas designated as environmentally challenged because air quality is worse or services are worse. So a whole variety of indicators that the state now uses and updates to highlight what's going on. And that's a great start. If you don't have the data, you don't measure it, you cannot address the climate issue or the justice issue, but we clearly need to go a lot further than just tracking it. So the biggest new piece of the equation, I don't need to tell anybody here, has been the Inflation Reduction Act. And just to remind us, the Inflation Reduction Act is designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the current projected pathway that we would be roughly 26% below where we would have been otherwise by 2030, but to get that into the 40% range. Our goal is 50%, but the current elements of the Inflation Reduction Act, this package of spending of $360 billion and largely carrots. There are very few sticks. We might come back to talk about that. There are not strong penalties, but there are a lot of inducements for governments, municipal governments, the private sector to invest in clean energy opportunities. Everything from the comments that Gail and Bruce made about how do we invest in solar for rental properties. There is a bill in California called the Solar Gardens Law that would put solar on the roof of buildings, not necessarily apartment buildings, but adjacent buildings, and give renters credit for that. That's a piece of policy that's being worked on here. It's also being worked on in the Netherlands. But the idea is that the Inflation Reduction Act and its two partner bills would give us a new toolkit. And I say the two partner bills because a bill that passed a month before the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, is a bill to strongly invest in onshoring or reshoring manufacture of computer chips. It's not a potato chip bill, it's a computer chip bill, but also investing in clean energy and, controversially to some, putting serious restrictions on the import of not just renewable energy technology, but computer and other technologies from governments that don't meet certain environmental standards. That's not to say that we are doing a great job, but this is a very clear effort pointing at the alleged claim, proven by some, alleged by others, forced labor in manufacturing solar and other materials in Xinjiang and Western China. This requires a clean energy, a clean bill of health for manufacturing. It's also now been used to drive new investments in solar manufacturing and computer chips and electronics, not just in the US, but also in quote unquote friendly companies, India and elsewhere. So there is a package that the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, and before that, the Infrastructure Act that was passed in 2001 would all bring together. Interestingly, and most optimistically for me, when you actually dig in to say what is in the IRA or the climate portion of it, it's about 160 billion of the 360 billion directly for clean energy projects. There's money to decarbonize the economy in a variety of ways, extending tax credits for clean energy projects, production credits for clean energy projects, investments in clean energy for residential sector, investing in heat pumps, not just for building owners, but also for renters, giving split subsidies between building owners and the tenants that occupy them, something which has been challenging to do before, but is now on the table. Investing in domestic manufacturing, I've highlighted. And then the third one on here, the 16% line, 60 billion for explicit projects in community of color. And some people would like that to be more than 16%, myself included, but this is the first time we've ever seen an investment, and certainly going from more or less zero, not quite zero, but a few billion a year targeted for low income and communities of color to now having a $60 billion pot is kind of a breathtaking change. There's other parts of it, resilience, some investments in rural communities, and rate relief for people in the state. But it's really this first ever call to find ways to put energy credits into the hands of people who are formerly excluded. So, for example, right, and as we all know, there's a $7,500 tax credit if you buy a new electric vehicle. Well, for the first time ever, there's a $4,000 tax credit for buying a used electric vehicle. Doesn't guarantee the used ones will be purchased by low-income Americans, but it's the first time that door has been opened. There are opportunities, there are these, as I mentioned before, there are these so-called split incentives where investments would go in to make rental buildings better weatherized, heat pumps, in terms of instead of air conditioning, and the benefits would be spread between the renters themselves and the homeowners. So there's a variety of features of this story. So one piece I want to highlight is that we know from a variety of different sources that even when we've invested in new technologies, we have frequently done so in ways that just propagate and perpetuate the inequalities of the past. So certainly the investment in rooftop solar, something for which California is by far the national leader. Something like 50% of all solar panels in the country on residential and small commercial rooftops are in California. And so there have been subsidies for this. And so this led to the kind of story highlighted here. Are these technologies only for the rich? And it's probably no surprise that most of the initial subsidies were certainly for more affluent members of society, Californians, people in the US overall. So the question is, can we do better than that? Can we move on from that story? Well, I would say we certainly can, but the data indicate that if we don't really change our structures, we don't benefit. So a big project that my laboratory did 3 years ago in partnership with Google, I think really highlights the story here. So what we did was we worked with Google that was in the process of acquiring rooftop images across the entire country. So there is a concerning Big Brother element, a mixture of satellite images, plane flights, imaging rooftops all across the country, the roughly 60 million rooftops in the nation, and using that data to identify where are solar panels around the country. You'd like to think you can look it up, but it's actually easier to get the data by doing overflights and putting the story together. So we did just that with them. We used the data to identify solar on residential properties, commercial properties, apartment buildings all across the country, and then did some machine learning, did some, you have to identify, is it a solar panel or is it a sunroof? I mean, is it a skylight? We sort of played all the fancy machine learning games. And what you find out is a very disappointing, although not surprising story. So what I plotted here, it's a little bit complicated, is the difference in the amount of solar that we see on rooftops around the country. And we did it not only for one income level by using census data and by using community ethnicity. We've identified communities that are more than 51% one particular ethnic group. So if you look at the green line first, that's when there's no dominant ethnic group again, across income levels from below the national poverty line, $26,000 a year, a full order of magnitude higher to almost $250,000 a year. The green is communities have no particular ethnic majority. And so you see that's the zero line. If you look at Caucasian dominated communities, what you see is that solar can be more than 50% more likely in those communities at the low income end, and it finally tapers off at the high income end. If you look at, however, Hispanic and African American communities, what you see is solar is 50% or more less likely for low income communities, and it just gets worse from there. In African American communities, again, there's not that many, sadly, at the high end. That's why the error bar, the width of that line goes up. But what you see is that solar is 70 to 80% less likely in African American majority neighborhoods at the high income level. There's a lot of ways to kind of tell the story about this. You can say, well, when we seeded or funded new solar installing companies, we preferentially gave money and resources and opportunity to those that were working in Caucasian majority areas. You can also say that the discrimination through redlining and other practices that we know goes on in this country that limits property access, not just ownership, but also rental of good units by minorities, has been perpetuated in solar. So the first part of the story is really figuring that out and then going forward from there. So that kind of result got a lot of attention. I'll just kind of drop up a number of kind of the articles about this kind of story here, but was really highlighted in terms of what are we learning about what's going on. And so Avi, I'll comments a bit long. I'll read it in a second. Let me kind of wrap a few more of these bits together and then just really open up for the questions. So I'll make sure I come back to that one as we go. I need to go through it in a little more detail. So we certainly see the opportunities to do things differently, but we have to recognize that we need to utilize new measures. And so as an example, Oakland is the site of a so-called eco-block project. It's an effort funded by the state of California, and it's designed to be an effort to do things different. This is in the Fruitvale section of Oakland, state of California effort to say, we want to install solar on the rooftops of neighborhoods, but we recognize that if we simply give out subsidies, they will generally go to the more affluent households. And so here's an opportunity where a neighborhood community group was founded, and the planning for the community is to install solar on all the rooftops, but not to make it individually owned. This is an HOA, a community assessment, and the solar goes on. The solar doesn't power your home directly. You can see a lot of individual homes here. On the left-hand corner, you see there's a large apartment building. All of that solar gets pooled in a battery. It's this gray building right here. And then it is sent back to all the residents equitably. And it also powers electric vehicle plug-in stations that are not in people's driveways, that are along the road. The community voted and the city approved to take these two-way roads and to make one of them one way and the other one the other way along this block. So they are widening the sidewalk, the tree areas. They're installing, you can see these EV charging stations on the light posts. And the community group decided that there would be an allocation where each member would get clean electricity back from the group, but those that consumed a large amount more because they had other things. There were some houses that had some grow rooms, some houses that had hot tubs. The community decided there would be an allocation, and if you were using far above the average, then you would then pay for that extra at a lower rate than you were currently paying PG&E, because this is self-generated solar. And it's an example of a build-out clean energy project in the community. It's something that is being replicated in France. Mayor Anne Hidalgo started a version in France as well. There's a variety of projects like this to build out this kind of clean energy network and infrastructure in communities. And the question is, Will we rapidly do this as we rebuild communities like Paradise after the fires? Can we make this part of the package that we invest in low-income design projects? So things like what Grid Alternatives and Oakland-based social justice and clean energy organization do in these communities. So here's just an example of a paper that came out today highlighting many of the lessons in looking at how we can make these sorts of metrics and tools that are now increasingly being discovered or developed part of our overall investment. Again, this is a national team working together on clean energy investment projects going forward. Last thing I'll say, then I'll open it up for questions, is that the US government has also developed an international partnership version of this. Stage 1 is something that I work at USAID, but it's a partnership across the government. It's called Net Zero World. And the idea of Net Zero World is that we will invest broadly in clean energy projects around the world in countries that commit to a decarbonization pathway. The first countries to sign on, surprising to some, were countries that are very heavily invested in fossil fuels, like Nigeria. Ukraine's partnership is on hold for obvious sad reasons, but Argentina, Chile, Egypt, and Indonesia are all partners where they develop clean energy plans, vet them in an international dialogue that'll happen next at the climate meetings in Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh next month. And then international investment are designed to flow to these project areas where there's activity going on to invest not just in decarbonization, but making this energy justice story central. And in Nigeria and in Chile and in 2 countries that are going to be announced over the coming weeks, one African, one in Southeast Asia, this just transition or this partnership around clean energy is core to the story. Now, I'm going to just quickly conclude because I want to, again, leave that last time for questions. And I'm going to just highlight one of the challenging bits of the story, and that is with all of the investments in innovation going forward, let me just highlight one last thing. I've gone a little bit too long. And that is, we know across the country that our housing policy and our climate policy are very strongly related. The more we make low-income Californians and US residents drive longer and longer distances, we are essentially building in a transportation inequality through our unaffordable aspects of housing. There have been various efforts going on here. So Senator Scott Wiener and I wrote a piece on this in the New York Times a couple of years back, highlighting the challenges. Right now, Lyft is involved in a bit of a complicated battle with the governor, who is actively campaigning against something that Lyft has proposed because it may be a larger subsidy for some of the ride-sharing companies. And it's part of announcements that have been made now by Lyft and by Uber. By 2030, all of their vehicles would be electric, and in particular that they would work to assist via subsidies in the lease or the purchase of EVs by their drivers. So there are efforts to pull the story together. Maybe the good news in the story is that we now have ample data that there are more jobs available in the clean energy, that's the green on here and in the blue, than there are in fossil fuels. That doesn't mean that those jobs are in the same place. There are real challenges to get those clean energy jobs out and available to all, but the numbers are quite dramatic in terms of how many more jobs there are if we invest in clean energy than dirty. And the last thing I said I would highlight before really turning this over is that one of the challenges we face is that we've learned a lot about how much of a cabal, a monopoly, the fossil fuel sector has been. And so one of the worries is that with massive demand increases in lithium, cobalt, many of these materials, by up to a factor of 1,000% demand increase by 2050, to power the clean energy revolution, we really are in a situation where if we don't find substitutes find ways to reduce the huge environmental and social exploitation that goes on in clean energy. And we have opportunities to do this, to reduce dramatically the amount of lithium, the amount of cobalt that's used in clean energy, and also to source them in different ways. We really have an opportunity to change the story, but we have not begun to think about the just transition. Has to be a materials just transition, not just a movement away from fossil fuels, which already is a challenging story. So I've gone a bit over. I am going to stop here and leave the last 8 minutes. I'm going to stop sharing screen so I can see everybody. And let me jump in and highlight, I think I understand, obvious question, then really kind of throw it open. So all the recent pubs from the COP authorities include carbon capture and storage in the calculations. And so just highlighting the perceptions of carbon capture. This is a controversial topic. There are some people who think it is absolutely vital. We're not going to get to clean energy without capturing carbon. Others think that it's actually a distraction. And the more we focus on capturing carbon, the more we extend the life of fossil fuel projects. And I guess I come down a little bit in the middle. I'm probably seen publicly as someone who is quite negative on the way we look at carbon capture today. That's largely because the carbon capture projects that actually exist today have all been funded by fossil fuel companies, as well as some billionaires. But in each case, there's clear data that carbon capture extended the life of existing fossil fuel projects. Just to be clear, that doesn't have to be the case. The Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy has been renamed the Office of Carbon Management. And one of the topics there is they are looking at doing carbon capture, whether it's drawing carbon directly out of the air, powered by renewable energy, or whether it's investing in companies that can capture carbon from the air and use it to make products like bricks, like road materials and things. So there's an economic upside to capture carbon. It doesn't guarantee that these will not extend the life of fossil fuels, but I think in the optimist side, you can see there's an opportunity there. So let me stop there on that one. I'm going to just throw it open, and maybe Susan, if there's,
Yes,
if you want to manage
yeah,
it, I'm happy for someone to jump in and ask. I know I didn't answer all of those in the text, but tried to hit a few as we went along.
Thanks, Dan. I think thanks for taking Avi's question. There was an earlier question, which I think is just definition. Solutions field science. Could you say just a few words for us lay people? What does that mean?
Yeah, I saw that one, and I'm going back up to it to make sure I read it right. I am not sure I understood exactly. Maybe just the person could say it out loud if you're
Okay.
not.
All right. Well, we'll leave that open.
Possibly mooted, but I'm trying to read it right now. I'm not seeing it now that I scrolled up. So the field of solution science. Yeah, so this is essentially, this talk has really been kind of a litany of projects that are now called solution science, meaning I might have bored you, but I didn't bore you in the beginning with a long discussion of how bad the climate emergency is. Solution science is the new international term for focusing on how to invest in a pro-justice way or a pro-environment way in clean vehicles, in distributed clean energy projects, and to really accept where we are in terms of the climate damage that we have already done, and unfortunately, that we're also going to do going forward, because we have already committed to a great deal of climate warming going forward. In fact, many of you might have seen, we're in a situation now where we have essentially committed to 3 or more feet of sea level rise going forward. So there are parts of this that are not undoable at this point.
So then if we were to leap down to Barbara Cohen's question, what happens to carbon when it is sequestered in old oil wells?
Yeah, so actually oil wells, I mean, it's a good question overall, but oil wells is not actually where we would put the carbon. Those groups that are pushing for CCS largely see it as we would inject it into former depleted gas wells. And it stays underground until it doesn't. And by that, what I mean is that in the same way that oil and gas stayed in those reservoirs for millions of years, carbon dioxide pumped down there would stay there because of the same geologic cap that caused the reservoirs in the first place. Now, if you're a pro CCS person, you say this is great. I mean, we have millions of years of data indicating that the oil and gas accumulated, so if we pump it down there, that's fine. My view is a little bit more skeptical, and that is we've already seen a few gas fields, such as the Woburn field in southern Canada, where gas did seep out of the ground. And because it was a government project, the government actually paid for additional work to secure it. But that doesn't mean that if we had a big private sector market of companies trying to sequester CO2, that we wouldn't have other problems. As I said, I'm not the biggest fan of this, but I also recognize that technologically it should be possible. And given the right carbon price and the right level of kind of government oversight, it is certainly workable. I do have my worries, but it's certainly possible.
And then Dan, let's jump to Gail Cooper's question,
Okay.
which she has revised a bit. How
Yep,
would
I see it.
You got it. How would you
Okay.
wake up?
So yeah, this idea of sticks and carrots is interesting. The IRA had almost no sticks, as has been discussed a fair amount. The reason for that is that if there were sticks, you can argue it wouldn't have been passed at all. To get Senator Schumer and Manchin to come to an agreement that others could adopt, and you'll notice even Senator Sinema from Arizona signed on without much additional. There was a little bit of tax back and forth, but but the IRA got through because it was a pro-investment package. Some people have actually gone further to say the IRA was the death knell of carbon pricing. I don't think that's true, but carbon pricing did not get any play, and it's because to get it through the Senator Manchin filter, it had to be a positive investment story. And it's a big one. One of the interesting features is that the IRA is expected to triple the amount of solar deployed across the country and roughly triple the amount of energy storage. We actually think it'll put more than that in, but that's the analysis by the government accounting office. So what we have right now is a pure carrot package. And I actually think that's okay, because the biggest thing we need right now is to get industry strongly investing here. The dark underside, however, is that emissions in the United States are not yet falling any more dramatically than they were before. Now, we've only been a few months into the IRA. There's no reason to expect it yet, but we need to get to that 3% annual decarbonization and get there fast. And so unless other states follow California and New York and New Mexico and Washington and have quite clear zero carbon goals and enforce them, we might get this ugly situation where we've built out a big new green energy economy, but we haven't actually beaten down the thing we need to do, and that's to get rid of the fossil side. So it's a real challenging piece. But if we look back 2 months, there was no prospect for an IRA, and the IRA is the largest investment any government has made in clean energy, except for China, which, while China made the biggest green energy investment, they also made the biggest fossil investment at the same time. So we're doing pretty well relative to our global peers, but that's not saying a lot given what the environmental story needs to be.
Dan, do we have time enough for two?
Happy to. Yep.
Here's, I want to, I know Gail would like to ask further question, but before we go to Gail, could Alan Gould, who is an OLLI member, has been very involved at the Lawrence Hall of Science. And he has just put in the chat that he's working as a volunteer on global systems science.
Yep, I see it in there. Yep.
Yeah, and Alan, do you want to say a few words? Is this a volunteer opportunity for any other OLLI member who might be interested in volunteering?
Hold on a second. There's an echo here.
Okay, you sound good from here.
We can hear you.
It's a high school science program that is kind of a legacy program. So there's not really, the short answer is there's not really volunteer possibilities there, except, you know, if you go to that website, you might see some options for volunteering, but it is kind of a legacy high school program that we wish would have taken off more, you know, teaching students about climate change as well as other science things that require science for understanding, societal issues that require science for understanding. So that's what that's about.
I mean, I love it. I actually think that the biggest push for a number of us adults has been our children and grandchildren, bringing back good energy and climate education from schools. I know Paul Chapman is on, who led an effort at private schools that went nationwide to get a lot of the educational materials out. Something I didn't highlight in the talk is that the progression in the cost of clean energy has been so dramatic that it's now cheaper to build a new renewable energy power plant, than it is to simply operate an existing fossil fuel one. That's a great story. The ugly footnote is that we also continue to subsidize fossil fuels in a way that that keeps them alive in our system long after the economics favor strongly the clean energy side. So there are other big battles to fight, but I think that youth education has actually been the big driver in a lot of the change here. Should we give Gail the last comment?
Yes. Yeah, if you would.
Gail, over to you.
Yeah, the reason I asked my question was I spent my career writing EPA regulations and attempting to enforce them. And I realized that coming from that federal regulatory perspective, I just thought that was the only way we could get things done. So in a way, I'm much uplifted when I focus on the carrot aspect of the program and the volunteer sector and the private sector. And that's why I was curious to know that if you don't have government regulation, and for example, if the Congress changes, you know, that we can, it seems like we can still make tremendous progress through these other mechanisms, and I guess through state initiatives, even if the federal government is AWOL or destructive.
Well, it's of course a tricky question, right? I mean, every time we get a switch to a party that is recalcitrant, is science or climate denying, we sort of say we can do all these things locally. We can certainly get a lot done locally, but I don't want to overplay it because we already have 11 states that have committed to zero carbon goals, and that's great, but it's really now not a technological story. We are now at a point where clean energy is cheaper if we're not back subsidizing dirty energy, and the clock is now so overdrawn. I mean, we should have started this 20 plus years ago, but we have now waited so long that we really can't afford missteps. And every time we see, you know, 1 billion animals dying in fires in Australia, when we see the Siberian Arctic be hitting 100 degrees, when we see the kinds of deaths in Pakistan, in Puerto Rico, in inner city Los Angeles from heat events, we recognize that we're paying a massive price today. And so I guess my worry is that if the government does step back even a little bit, and that certainly could happen in November, then our international partners that were skeptical when Biden first came into office and said, we're back, If we step back from that, we have a lot of governments that are going to feel justified in their step away from equity. I mean, in Brazil, in Italy, we have totalitarian governments and newly elected individuals who essentially side with the prior US administration. And we do not have room in the climate landscape for that kind of, anti-child, anti-equity, anti-gender types of policies that we unfortunately know are emerging from these parties, not just in the US. This is not just MAGA. I mean, what we're seeing in Italy and Brazil are very similar. So my worry is that we don't have time to say, let's have the progressive states go it alone.
Dan, thank you very much.
So thank you all for being on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, take care now,
Sure.
everyone.
Bye-bye.